Well, good morning, everybody. I make it 10:30. I want to give you a very warm welcome to this fourth webinar from Visit Scotland on coming through the COVID crisis. I'm Bill McFarlan. I'm the chairman of Pink Elephant Communications, and we've worked with Visit Scotland since its inception on communications. My guest today is Paul Bush, who's head of events for Visit Scotland. Paul and I worked together on the Commonwealth Games, in running the bid for the games themselves and then enacting them, the Ryder Cup. We've worked together on so many events in the past. And of course, he oversees an industry that brings £3 billion into the Scottish economy every year. So it's a huge topic of conversation today. So good morning, Paul. How are you?
Good morning. Very well, thank you, Bill.
Good. Let's start with your normal job. What does the normal job entail, and what have you been doing differently in the last 10 weeks?
Well, the normal job is, it's a fantastic job in Scotland. I have the privilege of looking after a portfolio that covers sporting events, cultural events and business events. As you say, worth a huge amount to the Scottish economy, over £3 billion, employs a lot of people, gives great visibility to Scotland as a great place to come see, look and visit. And it's quite interesting, having had the privilege of spending, the last 10 to 15 years working in that industry. I think most people in society, most people on the call this morning, it was a bit of a light bulb moment when the lockdown came, because everything was switched off immediately. So we've spent a long time, 10, 15, 20 years, if not longer in some cases, building our reputation. All of a sudden that came to an end. I think the last 10 weeks has very much been spent like this, on Teams calls and Zoom calls, helping the industry as much as we can in terms of working their way through an incredibly challenging time. And I think we'll touch on it a bit later, Bill, but the events industry, by its definition, because of COVID, will be probably one of the last things to come out of recovery and from lockdown. And so that in itself creates greater unique challenges, particularly economically, for people that are trying to sustain their businesses. But I think it's also taught us something. It's certainly taught me something this last 10 weeks, that communication has never been better, certainly in terms of the forums that we've held. About 150 people across the country have been involved in forums with either myself or members of my team. And it's given us some very focused areas, which again, we can talk about, that need immediate attention, which I think will long-term provide some positive benefits from COVID. And that might not seem particularly realistic at this time, but I'm as most people know, a pretty optimistic and positive person by definition. And I think we've got to look that way, in that, I was saying to you earlier this morning, bad athletes don't become bad athletes after one poor performance. And I think that, to everyone on this webinar this morning, Scotland is still a great destination for major events. And each of you in what you do will come back one day, and we will be able to celebrate that great vibe that we have within the events community sometime in the future.
And how does Scotland and how do each event look after, if you like, the reputation of that event and the changes that they have to make for the future? We'll come into the detail of that in a moment, Paul, but how important is it to work hard in this period to make sure that we are in the best position when we come out of all this?
I think everyone will have their own unique scenarios, and we'll have people this morning, the length and breadth of the country, from cities, from rural communities, totally different geographies, totally different size scale of events. Some will be commercially sound, some will very much survive week to week, year to year, and it's about planning. And I know that's probably might sound not the easiest thing to do at this point in time, but you've got to look into the future and try and imagine what your event will look like in the future. Because the one thing that I'm very sure in my own mind is that certainly for the next 1, 2, 3 years, the events industry will be very different to an events industry that we had mid-March, which is only 2.5, 3 months ago. And so we've got to be prepared for that. We've got to take it in our stride. I think we're particularly good at that in Scotland. We're very resilient as a nation. And I think the events industry is also very resilient as well. So you've got to look at your own particular business model. You've got to look at your own particular event and try and design that in the new forum. Again, we'll talk about some of the advice that's being developed, which will obviously, from a sectoral perspective, help people moving forward. But, you know, we all know the sort of things that we're going to have to be doing. You know, there's going to be greater hygiene factors around events. I think social distancing will exist for some significant time, particularly in the environment that we work in, because by definition, events are social beasts in that we like to bring people together and enjoy ourselves. Unfortunately, that is not something we can do in society because of the nature of the virus at this time. So we're going to have to be clever, we're going to have to be smart, we're going to have to be innovative, we're going to have to be lateral, and we're going to have to take risks in a different way that protect us from the virus, but sustain the business.
And really, the events industry, Paul, has been harder hit, I would imagine, than any other sector of tourism, just because it's all about crowds and it's about the atmosphere created by a crowd. Now, I suppose that will worry people more than anything else, because it's the very nature of the crowd, whether it's the football or rugby crowd or whether it's the concert crowd, that gives it the unique atmosphere, isn't it?
It is, and I think, you know, most people on this call will be looking for a degree of confidence into the environment that they're going to travel into. You know, I mean, it's quite interesting, you know, whether you go into a supermarket now, it's a different experience, isn't it? You know, you have 2-meter queues outside the door. There are lots of people will be now wearing face coverings or face masks. Your trolley will be wiped down, probably depending on where you go before you go in. And people that take your cash, probably by contactless or card now rather than cash, will have plastic screens in front of them. So we have to convert that into an event norm, which is very different for the future. What does that look like? You know, can we have an events industry in Scotland that actually has no tickets in the future? You know, can we have an events industry where there's no cash? I think there's some of the huge challenges that we're going to have to face. And some people, obviously, you know, the larger events will arguably be able to put those in place easier than the smaller events, just because of their nature in terms of size and scale. And I think we have a responsibility now as an organisation to help the events industry in Scotland through that. I think it's very important that we listen to the concerns that people have, take those fully on board, whether that be in terms of preparing for what the new norm looks like, or actually preparing to help people. How do they go ticketless? How do they go cashless? And they're just some of the simple things. And, you know, how do we manage the toilet environment in the event scenario, the F&B environment? So we're going away from the real, I guess, the blockbuster enjoyment, whether that be at you know, an event in the islands or in the Highlands or in the borders, to actually look at the absolute practicalities of how you can get your event up and running.
Is much of this dependent on vaccine? I mean, do you believe that the event industry will return to what we would have called normal if and when a vaccine is available?
I think it will one day, and I think we have to be optimistic in that respect. But I think for me, there's 3 or 4 things in this respect. I think we're going to learn to cope with it and manage the virus. We're going to learn to cope with it as a world because we're going to have to. We'll find a treatment or we'll find a vaccine. And I think it could be a combination of all 4 of those. But certainly initially, whilst there's no vaccine or treatment, and I think they are quite different to some extent in terms of what scientists say, we're going to have to learn to live with it. And unfortunately, in the environment we live in, we're going to have to learn to live with it in a very different way to what we've have done in the past.
Is Scotland in some ways at an advantage, Paul, in that we can now see across the world, New Zealand, for example, really unwinding quicker than other places? They managed to keep their spike lower than most places. So is Scotland watching these other countries, looking at events and learning from them along the way?
I think ironically, there's an advantage to being behind the curve of coming out of lockdown. And again, that might sound counterintuitive and a little bit negative, but I think we are going to learn from what other countries learn in terms of, you know, the pace that they come out of lockdown. Funnily enough, I was talking to my colleague last week in Wellington, Susie Sawbridge, who some of you may know. And this was on a Thursday night, and she said the following day, New Zealand returned to normality, literally. Restaurants and bars were open. They've still got some challenges over mass gathering numbers. But in essence, they are very much on an upward curve. And they've had an advantage in that they're an island. They locked it down very quickly. And they've managed to control the virus probably quicker than most of the countries in the world. I mean, some of the Far East countries have done a particularly good job as well. But there's been pockets, particularly in Europe, where there's been huge challenges. And I think there's still some concerns, whether that be at Westminster or at Holyrood, that we need to behave as a social construct and as human beings to ensure that we don't get a second spike. Because for me, a second spike could be more damaging than the first spike, particularly in terms of our industry and also our economy.
I suppose it's all about confidence. I suppose the two factors are, one, what do governments allow? And two, what are people prepared to do in the new normal? And how much of what venues and event organisers can do in the next few months, Paul, will be about ensuring that they are doing the maximum to give confidence back to people so they come back to events.
I think that's a really important point, Bill, and it goes back to what I said earlier, in that communication around that trust and confidence messaging will be really important. Visit Scotland has a role to play there in terms of giving confidence to visitors and tourists that Scotland is a safe place to come and visit again. But then in a micro sense, we need to drill that down into the specific event format, so is it safe to go to the toilet whilst you're at an event? Have they been cleaned regularly? In terms of touching of surfaces, will people have to wear masks? We don't know yet at this point. In terms of some of the signage that will be required, whether that be signage on the floor or tensile barriers, etc., in terms of how people move around the venue. It's been interesting this week watching horse racing and snooker return. And I'm sure some of you saw this morning, that the snooker table was wiped down literally every few moments after a player had touched it, to give that hygiene and cleanliness a surety, I guess, to the players. On the horse racing at Newcastle yesterday, all of the jockeys were wearing masks. And so I think it's quite interesting, these developments that are starting to take place now. And behind closed doors sport particularly, I think will teach us a lot in terms of how that then can be rolled out, whether it be into a cultural environment, which obviously in terms of a theatre or a music venue is probably much more challenging because it's an indoor venue. So obviously you have much greater social distancing challenging rather than an outdoor venue. But I think over the next few weeks and months and years, we are going to have to learn with it, and our events will look very different. Going back to where we were probably 3 or 4 months ago is not going to happen for a long, long time.
I've been speaking to one event venue about helping them with their virtual conferences and concerts in the future. Part of their concern, of course, is that the money goes elsewhere rather than, of course, people coming to their venue. But really, there has to be a lot of innovation now to make sure that the venue is able to create the whole parallel conference, the virtual conference, the hybrid as such. Now, are you helping any of your venues with that kind of thinking just now? Or do venues come to their own conclusion on the way ahead?
Oh, without doubt. I think that, it's been quite interesting that Hay Book Festival has been virtually online as normal this year. And it's been interesting they've managed to monetize that in some senses as well. So I do think that you're going to get parallel streams of event delivery. You might well have the live audience. It might be a smaller audience. The ticket price might be higher, or artist fees might come down, which means ticket prices can be a much more manageable situation. And that might be supplemented in the short term by virtual gigs online or virtual whatever online. We've had lots of discussions with people around virtual drive-in cinemas, which I think is the obvious thing that you can do in an outdoor space. We have lots of car parks all over Scotland or grounds where you could actually pull that up quite quickly, but that could move into the, pop concerts, drive-in pop concerts, drive-in opera, drive-in theatre. And 3 or 4 months ago, we probably wouldn't have been thinking about that. I mean, some of the English championship teams were offering season ticket holders to buy a virtual pop-out of themselves and stick it in the stand.
Exactly.
So when the games were shown back on television, you couldn't go to the match, but you might see yourself sitting virtually in a seat. Now, from a sustainability point of view, I'm not sure lots of pop-up season ticket holders in seats is the right thing to happen, but it's interesting how people are thinking.
I believe Germany has been playing around with that idea, and it's quite weird to see it enacted. You talked about driving. There was an early question, and I've taken a note of it, wanted to ask you in any case. And the questioner says, so legally in Scotland, are we set up for drive-in cinema, theatre, concerts? Does it need government approval? Any idea, give us an insight into what would you have to do to be able to make this work?
Well, I think in the current climate that we live in, it'll all need approval in terms of, is it safe to do so? So there'll be the government approval and the scientific approval. Fortunately, over the last few weeks, in terms of some of the behind closed doors sports events we've been talking about, we've had some very positive discussions with people in government, and particularly with Jason Leach, in terms of helping us through that process so that when we come up with the guidelines, that the industry now requires from a sectoral perspective, they can be approved very quickly. And we saw at the weekend that DCMS have now issued guidelines for domestic behind closed doors sports events in England. We'll be able to follow that, I hope, very shortly in Scotland, which will give some advice. And last week, many of you probably saw that we have in principle agreed for a behind closed doors golf event in Scotland in October, which obviously is some time away. But the Men's Scottish Open's been rescheduled for the first week in October at the Renaissance course, with a very strict sets of protocols and regimes behind them, subject to the position at that time still being acceptable, both from a scientific point of view and a government point of view. And it could be interesting to see how that works. I mean, people will have to live in bubbles, they'll have to travel in bubbles, they'll need to be tested, the players will, TV crews, and officials will all need to be within that same bubble as well. But it just goes to show that actually, relatively speaking, we are starting to make baby steps to come out of what for many people has been an incredibly difficult and challenging time. So
if you take golf, for example, there, and I've played 3 games of golf now, very excitedly, very poorly, I have to say as well, since lockdown ended. It's really easy to do everything correctly in a social distancing way. But so much of golf and everything else does depend on revenue from crowds. The Open is obviously a huge money spinner. So to what extent do you then have to look at your event at, I think is it Archerfield, or is it Renaissance rather, in October, in the East Coast, as a TV event and forget about crowds in the meantime? I mean, is that the thinking there?
Well, for the European Tour, who are the rights holders for that event, they have significant income streams from sponsors and television. So for them, maintaining them through the television pictures is a critical part of their business model. But obviously for most events, that won't be the case because they don't have vast sums of TV income or sponsorship. And they'll very much be dictated by footfall through the gate. So that's going to be the challenge, I think, for most. And it's going to be some time before actually that we will get back to that situation at all. And, without sounding negative, I mean, even next year for mass gatherings looks a challenge. But we've got to work through this very, very carefully. We've got to work through it pragmatically and realistically. And I think in time, we will get back to a point where mass gatherings do take place. We just don't know when that's going to be.
Well, what about the certainty of that? I know I've been furiously cancelling flights and so on to go down to see Queen at the O2. And of course, I've had tickets for Who and Simple Minds, bands like that in Glasgow. Now that most of them are just put off a year. 2020 might be remembered as the year that failed to materialise. But do you really believe that a year from now, the Who, for example, is maybe March or April, that's postponed to next year. Do you really believe that's going to happen?
Well, I think you've got to hope it will. I mean, certainly talking to people within that industry, whether that be venue owners or music promoters, we talk about confidence within the spectator. There's also confidence within the performers. A lot of these performers are, you know, the AAA performers, particularly that come to places like the Hydro and P&J Live in Aberdeen, they have their own confidence factors. And I think they've taken the decision that, well, let's leave it until 2021 before we travel. But, you know, until we see how we come out of lockdown, what the impact is on the events industry, how we make these slow, small steps to recovery, I think it's going to be hard to say whether we'll be going back to venues in the short or medium term with 12,000 capacity.
I'm seeing a comment there that there already are 2 drive-in events in Scotland currently going ahead, a drive-in comedy in Glasgow and Edinburgh Zoo drive-in concerts. Now, one of the great things I've found in the last 10 weeks is people have been incredibly innovative. So does the optimist in you say, all right, this has been a terrible thing for the industry. However, we've been forced to innovate and it could create a better industry, a safer industry, a fairer industry, a more evenly spread industry, one that reaches perhaps the world rather than just people coming to the live event?
Very much so, and I think it's you know, beholden on all of us to seize that opportunity. And I do see it as an opportunity, despite what people might think, and you might say that's not realistic in the environment we live. But I actually think, whether that be in a cultural environment, a business environment, or a sporting environment, you should be able to experience in the future the same events at home, paying for the privilege. So we're looking at potentially parallel streams of income from parallel streams of participants, spectators. So for example, you know, I know Mike Jardine's on the call from the mountain bikes, but you could have a situation whereby you could sit at home, watch the mountain bike World Cup, and one of the riders has a camera on his head, and you have that exhilaration of thrill from your armchair, which is very different. And you could do the same within a cultural environment for one of the Edinburgh International, you know, showcase events in August. So rather than traveling to the venue, which most people will still wish to do because part of it is about social interaction, it's part of the buzz of going to the venue, it's a night out, you might have a meal beforehand, you know, you might go with friends or family, but you can actually take the opportunity to actually have that same experience at home. And I think we've all been incredibly impressed over the last 10 weeks, how the human has coped with a totally alien environment, you know, Teams, Zoom, whatever it might be in terms of the tool of choice that you've used. But actually, environments like this, webinars, are incredibly successful now. I was on one a couple of weeks ago with an economic study group in Paris. They had live simultaneous presentations from Canada, Europe, and Singapore, and live voting of the questions that came from the participants during the actual Zoom call itself. So it is going to change, you know, and so for some parts that will be a risk, but we've got to seize that risk and turn it into an opportunity, and look at potentially having 2 different models for, you know, a participant who's not there and a participant who is there.
I know from a conversation we had earlier, Paul, that you'd be concerned about this whole supply chain. Now, in the first call we did with Riddle, we talked very much about that, how tourism and the jobs in tourism are all part of one spider's web, a network here. Events are clearly the same. Is there enough financial support to help those meantime in the supply chain? And will that supply chain be changed dramatically at the end of all this, in your opinion?
I think it's one of the biggest risks we face, actually. I think by definition, most events are pretty resilient and will continue to survive because of the people that they have within them. But actually, the supply chain is a real worry for me. And whether that be the food and beverage industry, you know, whether it be the pop-up food and beverage, which is becoming a key part of lots of events now, the people that might do your signage, the barrier contractors, the music auditorium contractors, the sound and light contractors. I think they're the people that have struggled and found it the hardest through the whole COVID process because of where they've sat in the support chain mechanism of funding. Now, I know that governments both in Scotland and London are still looking at that and hoping that they can offer further support to those sectors. But I would encourage, you know, people have talked about, you know, shop local, as we've all done probably in a COVID environment, we've got to ensure that we protect that supply chain moving forward, and encourage them to try and, keep their businesses moving for as long as they can, because we can't operate any events without the supply chain.
And to what extent are you encouraging suppliers to think differently? The analogy I've used in our business is you go into an alpine tunnel expecting to see Switzerland on the other side and you see the Sahara. Now, are you asking people in the supply chain to think about what the future is going to look like and adapt their business for the Sahara rather than Switzerland? Or are you asking them to hold tight to see what happens?
I think it's probably a bit of both. I think they do need to hold tight, but they're also going to have to adapt to the new norm, in terms of, does it take longer to put construction into a venue because of social distancing in the initial time? Are the hygiene factors meaning that, the people that work within your team's going to have to spend longer actually erecting whatever it might be? And when they operate, do you need more people because you might need more breaks in terms of social distancing? So I think they're all the things we need to work through. And at this point in time, we're probably quite unclear as to what that means in practical terms. And that's where I think, going back to your point about countries like New Zealand, I think it'd be really interesting to learn about practically on the ground, how are they actually achieving what they need to achieve to successfully deliver an event.
Is this going to vary, do you believe, around the UK? I mean, are you seeing, we talked about the slight advantage you could interpret it as Scotland watching other people unfold from this? Or do you see the UK as a whole having a similar strategy on events in the future?
I would hope the latter, because I think that consistency and continuity is important for the consumer and the customer. I think it would be foolish to have different rules in the 4 home countries in terms of what you can and can't do at events. But I think that would be very much dictated by government and also by scientific advice. So actually, you might well have that. In the last few days, we've heard very practically from scientists and governments that there might well be hotspots around the UK where lockdown needs to go back into force. So unfortunately, by definition, that will have an impact then upon an event, so that you might have an event in the West Country of England and in Wales and in Northern Ireland and Scotland that has different rules and regulations at different times, depending on where they are in terms of the R number. We've all got used to trying to understand what the R number means, but I guess that's the greatest dictator in terms of how the virus is controlled by the government.
Charlie Wood's asking for your views, Paul, about social distancing at an outdoor environment as opposed to indoor locations. I think you've touched on it, but can you see the outdoor venues being ahead of the indoor venues in getting something back on the road again?
I think by definition, I think we've all been advised that an outdoor space is a much more conducive environment than an indoor space. And obviously, again, by definition, that means that our cultural product will probably have greater challenges than our sporting product, as will our business events as well in terms of their indoor environment by definition. And it depends on what the advice is regarding social distancing. Currently it's 2 meters. Will that go to 1 meter? Will it go to half a meter? Because that will all have a significant impact on how you can and can't operate your event. I think I saw an opera in Austria last week. They showed the seating location of the social distancing, and it looked quite a strange environment because there was seating in place for various different constituent groups, whether it will be a single person, a couple, or a family of 4. And so you've got to take that into account in terms of how you lay out your seats. And actually they've taken seats out. So they've got some rows of 1s, some rows of 2s, and some rows of 4s, or intersperse them across the auditorium. And again, going back to our earlier comments, that has significant impact then on the commercial income that you can derive from that event.
Paul, let me jump in whilst we recover Bill from the depths of wherever he's gone to. Let me just ask, what's the main message you would like viewers to take away from this?
I think the main message I'd say is we've got to be patient. We've got to still be optimistic. We've still got to be aspirational, ambitious, because that's why Scotland has had such a great reputation in the events industry. But I think the one thing this has learned, I've learned from this process in the last 10 weeks, and I think my team have as well, and I think generally across Visit Scotland and other organisations, I think it's given us the opportunity to reconnect better with the industry. I've never spoken so frequently to so many people in the industry, and I think it's something that we really have got to maintain, because that dialogue has been fantastic. I've appreciated speaking to every single one of you over the last few weeks and learning from you and learning about the challenges that you've had and trying to understand some of the complexities that, that's meant in terms of moving forward. I remember, in the first few weeks talking to Jeff Ellis at 8 o'clock at night whilst on a dog walk about, how the hell are we going to get music venues back into, some form of shape in the future. And we don't do that because life has been very much about running at 100 miles an hour. Nobody would think twice about jumping on a train or a plane to London to a meeting. I'm not sure we'll do that in the future. We'll probably do them virtually. Costs might predict that, but I think just the way we change things to do. So for me, in terms of the work that we do with the industry, I think our teams are looking very carefully at our funding programs. I think they have to be more agile. They have to be more receptive. They have to be less bureaucratic. And I have to say that's something I can commit and promise to that we're going to do, because, after 10, 15 years of having similar programs, I think probably some of them have become a bit too bureaucratic. I think we've got to be a bit more focused in terms of our industry advice, and particularly over the next 12, 18, 24 months, working through the challenges and the propositions that we're jointly going to have, but sharing best practice. So somebody learns how to utilize a 500-seater venue, with its nooks and crannies, and then we can put that online so people can learn. I think we've got to use best examples in terms of virtual and digital events, which is critical for us moving forward. We've just reinstigated the Events Advisory Group, which has been something I've been very passionate about, because the one thing through the whole of this process, and the one thing that you as an industry told us, was that the voice of the events industry was getting lost in the overall debate around where we sat from an economic perspective. So that meets for the first time tomorrow, which is really important. And the last thing that we touched on, Colin, is that we've got to look very carefully at, the supply chain and how we maintain that and sustain it and hopefully even grow it.
There are several questions I'm going to combine here, Paul, and it's really about looking at each business individually and checking out that business and licensing them. And the questions are really getting at the question, will there be consistency from local authority to local authority? Will businesses be looked at individually? Because if a standard is set for the industry, then surely those who meet the standard and exceed it are the ones who can accelerate forward.
I think there has to be, Bill, and I think it's really important that we come up with a clear set of guidelines. I mean, most of the guidelines are being developed through guidance from WHO, which are obviously the world leaders in this environment, and WHO have two documents that currently sit online. One was published in, I think, the early part of March in terms of mass gatherings events, one that was only published in the last few days. So if you've not seen it, I would encourage you to go to the WHO website. We have a team internally now which is working with colleagues in Scottish Government, where we're developing those sectoral guidelines, which will provide that continuity and consistency, which will be the same sectoral guidelines that are going out for any industry, whether that be education, transport, bed and breakfast, hotels, etc. But there'll be a specific set of sectoral guidelines for the events industry. And I know that, the big venues are doing some work on there. So we're currently going to actually road test that with a number of major event practitioners, the people that actually do, the work on the ground at putting people into venues. Will it work? The G4S people, the health and safety or environment officers at venues, and then publish that hopefully in the next few weeks. Once it's got approval from the government and scientific advice to say, this is the template and the framework that you then need to work towards to bring your events back into life.
Paul, that link has just been shared by Andy and Jenna for those who want to see the WHO guidelines. So thank you, Andy and Jenna, for doing that. An interesting question from Joe Goldblatt, and it really is about, can we learn from what South Korea has done? It's just put on Phantom of the Opera, checking temperatures as people come in, wearing face masks, but without social distancing, and according to Joe, without any incidents of the disease being transmitted. Now, it's interesting because I saw Mr. O'Leary from Ryanair saying, forget what governments are telling you, we'll just check their temperature on the way into the airport. And we know he's rather cavalier in the way he goes about his business. But I'm wondering if he's got a point. And I'm wondering if the private sector here can work with government to say, we'll do a lot of this, but there are ways we can avoid the social distancing, which is the killer for revenue.
I think you're right. And you know, if you think about life, you know, and life cycles, you know, we all remember 9/11. We all remember where we were on 9/11. I remember I was traveling to Aberdeen that day and saw the second aircraft sadly go into the second tower. The following morning, I flew to Birmingham. Life was very different. We queued outside of Edinburgh Airport for 2 hours. We were not allowed to take any hand luggage on the plane. And out of that came the fact that we now have to take liquids below 100 ml in a plastic wallet onto planes. Very shortly, you'll be able to take your liquids of any size and scale onto a plane because the scanners have now been developed to do that. And I think we're in exactly the same part of that life cycle and life chain as to where we were with 9/11 with COVID. We will learn to live with it. And whether it becomes, you know, a treatment, a vaccine, you know, precautions or a way to live with it, looking at what people like Korea have done will give us those indications to move forward. And so, you know, as we said earlier, learning the lessons from the countries that are moving out earlier than us will help us significantly and provide role models, it will provide best practice, it will provide case studies that we can then implement, hopefully, for a quicker move back to normality.
There have been a couple of questions on PPE. This one from Stephen says, do you think the promotion of PPE would allow us all to return to normal sooner? And there was a previous one that said, now, whose cost is that? Is that the venue's cost if they have to hand out protective masks?
Again, I think that's an interesting question, and I think we don't have an answer for that yet. Undoubtedly, events will cost more to run, and it's something we're very aware of. It's something we are talking to government about. And over the next few weeks, we need to get to grips with that, because to get a safe passage back into some form of norm and some type of event structure, there needs to be hygiene factors on the ground. You know, whether it's additional cleaners to clean toilets, you know, that has a cost to it. You know, whether everybody has to wear a mask at the venue, that you can't access a mask or you can't afford to buy a mask. So all of that needs looking at, and in a strange way, I think that's probably as important as us providing funding for events, because without the hygiene factors around the event, whatever that might be, you can't do the event in the first place over the next few weeks and months.
And as we look at the coming weeks, I mean, clearly people want a timescale, and I completely understand a government being unable to give us a timescale until they see what's happening. Now, is there any indication from you, from your discussion with the Scottish Government, as to whether there is a timescale, but it's only going to be revealed when we see the results of the uneasing of lockdown?
I don't, you know, if I'm really honest, and, you know, I have to be honest, there's not a timescale. You know, we don't have a timescale, and to some extent, I actually don't think that's a massive problem, because I actually think we need to get the framework right, and we need to get the look and feel right before we have a timescale, and we haven't got the look and feel right yet. You know, only yesterday we had our first, you know, live sport back in the UK. You know, we've not got back to a situation where we've got, you know, live cultural events or live business events. You know, we've got some virtual and some hybrid virtual events taking place at this time. But I think it's really important to understand that, you know, events do sit in that phase 3, 4 in a Scottish context. That's not going to be quick. It's not going to be soon. We have got some green shoots of recovery. Hybrid, behind closed doors events, plan for October. There could be women's golf events in August. It's something we're working very hard to achieve with very small numbers. So I think it's watch this space and listen, but that doesn't mean to say that people should sit back. I think they need to actually plan for the day now when they're going to be in a position to restart.
Martin Fitchie is making the point that the calendar for 21-22 is becoming very busy. To what extent are you and other agencies helping to coordinate all of that? Because if things are pushed further down the line, I can imagine it could become rather chaotic, Paul, in terms of different businesses and events fighting for the same space.
Yes, and I think they're very different depending on the genre. So, in a cultural context, most things seems to have been cancelled or postponed. And postponed has been quite a strength, particularly our Years and Coastal Waters programme has been very much pushed into 21. So that's a real positive in that respect, and that opportunity has not been missed. Business events have very much been rescheduled. Again, there'll be some venue considerations in terms of other bookings that take place there. I think the biggest congestion obviously has been around the major sporting event schedules. And things like the Olympics moving, Euro moving, have all provided that congestion into the marketplace. So in 2022, we've got the situation where we've got 3 major athletics events in the space of 5 weeks. We've got World Athletics, Commonwealth Games and European Championships from mid-July till early August. Now that creates some challenges in terms of not only the competitors, and also the spectators, but also in terms of the TV viewers as well, because there's got to be some spacing out of those events over that period of time. So it's careful. It's again slow steps. I sense again there's been a huge amount of collegiateness in the approach across all the sectors to work that through. But probably the biggest challenge to all those events, and particularly from a Scottish perspective, is that when we've got more events taking place in a shorter time frame, if we don't have the supply chain in place, which I think is the one that's probably got its greatest fragility at present, we won't be able to deliver all those events in a shorter time frame.
It's a big concern for many people, Paul, that the furlough scheme, which has been running well for many people, is going to end in October. There's going to be a huge burden then on the employer, and we wonder if there's going to be a huge spike in unemployment around that time. What would you say to those who are looking for reassurances about further financial support? Anything that you know of coming through the pipeline, any way they can be helped?
Well, certainly from a personal perspective, I would advocate, an additional tail to the furlough scheme for, the tourism hospitality industry generally, because I think it's the one that's going to come back in the latest. It will need the greatest support moving forward. And without that tapered furlough approach, we are in danger of losing jobs, and therefore we're then losing capacity and capability in the industry. So when the time comes to restart, it becomes even more difficult because you haven't got those skilled people on the ground to actually undertake the work that's required. So I do know that, but again, both in Holyrood and in London, they're very conscious of where the tourism and events industry sits in that life cycle. And it's up to all of us to continue to make that case over the next few weeks and months.
There's an interesting question here, which is the reverse of much of what we've been talking about. And that is, will we still have adequate contractors still to be operating to allow the glut of events from 2021 onwards? I mean, this is the supply and demand quandary in all this, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, that absolutely links back to the supply chain, I mean, it could be a bonus time for contractors because they might have so much more work, but after the less of them, is there a situation where price goes up because, supply and demand, the usual sort of economics comes into play. So it's really important to protect that supply chain again over the next few weeks and months.
We've talked about New Zealand and we've talked about South Korea. Have you seen other examples around the world of where venues are getting back to a normality and have been successful by being innovative in how they've gone about it?
I still think it's early days, to be honest, Bill. I mean, I talk to Australia and colleagues down there most weeks, and they're very, very slowly. They're quite a way behind New Zealand. I mean, they haven't even got tourism flights back across the Tasman Sea yet. So it's going to take some time. And I think Australia is saying that they don't perceive anything's going to really start to move again until 2021. Europe is very, very slowly moving. South America is still very much heavily hit with the pandemic at this time. And obviously, North America has challenges other than pandemics as well, which, complicates the situation even further. So it is slow. I think that most governments are looking to try and get normal life and society back to whatever normality that is in terms of visiting friends and family, which is obviously a welcome change for most people over the last week or so. But it's about being patient with the events industry, because I know it sounds probably quite a negative thing to say, but it's not going to be quick.
Some of the figures are eye-watering. The last figures I saw for the revenue from the Edinburgh Festival are £313 million into the Scottish economy. Now, of course, we're unable to replace that because it's been cancelled this year. But can you see us catching up in the years to come after that? Or is that just going to be a hit that everyone's going to have to take?
Well, I think catching up is difficult, but getting back to where you were is absolutely possible in the future. Now, whether that happens in 21, 22 or 23 remains to be seen. But, the Edinburgh International Festivals, the 13 festivals that make up that portfolio is still the greatest cultural festival in the world. People will still want to come and see the Tattoo live on the Castle Esplanade, or go to the Fringe or the Book Festival or the International Festival. And it's one of Scotland's great USPs, and it's a real gem in the crown, both for Edinburgh and Scotland. And so, despite the juxtaposition that we've had recently around over tourism, I still think that once confidence returns to that market regarding travelling, and I'm sure that on previous webinars you talked about, there'll be very much, I think, a focus of domestic and staycation in the short term, but that can add to that. More people from Scotland and the UK going to see our events. People will travel from abroad. It might take longer for certain markets to travel, but by this time next year, one would hope that there is more confidence back in the market for people to travel and visit our great events.
So the figures are always interesting because they're simply the facts. 1 in 7 people have holiday trips to Scotland to include a live music event, 1 in 9 to attend a festival, 1 in 11 a sporting event. Is that going to be recovered, in your opinion? Or is there a danger in this period that people simply go elsewhere, perhaps to other parts of the world that are recovering more quickly than Scotland?
I think until we get back to where we were, people, will probably go to venues that are open rather than ourselves. But I have every confidence that the product and the portfolio offer that Scotland has will recover and bounce back. We are quite unique as a nation in that, we've talked about the Edinburgh festivals, the Open Championship on average coming 3 out of 5 times. Arguably the most historical and, cultural hogmanay in the world, things like Celtic connections. We have some very, very special events here. They're not going to go away and die because of COVID-19, because I do know that our events industry is very tough, it's very resilient, and the people within it have great fortitude, and we will get back to where we are. So, despite the fact that we've probably still got a long road of recovery ahead of us, I have every confidence that as a nation, we will bounce back, and hopefully bounce back stronger because of some of the innovative ways that we're actually going to present our events in the future. So talking to Nick Barney recently, he might well have a sold out book festival in Edinburgh in 21 or 22, but he'll have a parallel book festival that's virtual, that's increasing his income, having monetized it.
And a good point by Neil Dalglish here. He says the bottom line is that 2020 is just being lost to a lot of suppliers here. And it's a year's lost income. Of course, it's going to be the same for many people in the tourism industry generally in Scotland. But he's saying, can you as an organisation put pressure on the governments involved simply to make a special case to extend tourism and the events industry for furlough and any other grant support that's available?
As I said earlier, everyone's making that case all the time that, the tourism and events industry is a critical part of the economic recovery strategy, not just for Scotland, but for the UK. And I think there is a recognition that because we're going to be last out the block by definition, because of the nature of the business, there is a case there for an extension to the furlough scheme if at all possible. But I would also encourage everyone on this call to make that case as well, because we can't do it on our own. So it's an important voice for the industry. And I think, you know, the events advisory group that meets tomorrow, I'm sure that's one of the topic areas that they'll be discussing and taking back to the Cabinet Secretary in the current weeks.
It's worth reading out Karen Wood's comment. To accelerate Scotland's recovery, we need to harness our collective inspiration, creativity, scientific advances, resilience, and professionalism. How can we all contribute to the national effort and maximise our opportunity? Any particular view on that, Paul?
Well, I think that's a really good point from Karen, and it's something that I think most people on this webinar would have some understanding of. But it's for each and every one of us to do that individually and collectively. Whether that be through providing that confidence in the market to the consumer, because I think that's probably going to be one of our biggest challenges. It will be confidence for people to come back to venues and come back to mass gatherings. Will people feel safe? If we're really honest about it, COVID-19 has been a really interesting debate in, the mortality of a human being. So having that confidence to go back into those venues and those environments will be really important. So we have a responsibility collectively as an industry to ensure that we have that continuity and consistency we talked about previously, so that people come back knowing that they are safe. And, whether it's Joe's example in Korea, whereby everyone's given a face mask at the door and can go and watch Phantom of the Opera, which is an interesting analogy with Phantom of the Opera itself.
The Phantom might get lost in the audience.
Absolutely. But, for me, I think confidence is going to be one of the biggest factors. And, we've not talked about it, but, there'll be some great reticence in rural communities about places that have not actually witnessed any particular spikes in COVID, where they'll be nervous about tourists coming back or events coming back. So it's providing that assurance and reassurance and a surety, not just for the people coming to the event, but where we're taking the events as well.
A very specific question from Callum Hogg here. Any news on Event Scotland currently suspended national programme funding?
Yes, we're currently working through that, and once we have a greater clarity in terms of the roadmap, in terms of phases 3 and 4, that information will be going out to the applicants.
Helen Urquhart was asking about events only counting attendance by being in person in the past. Now, when it becomes virtual, does that change?
I think it does, yes, particularly if you can monetize it, or you find a way that actually they've got some sort of experience of it in a virtual context, and that actually might mean they go to the event live next time. So I think, there's all sorts of ways of looking at that. And I mean, one of the things I'm quite keen to do is to try and develop some form of events channel for Scotland, whereby we can put customer experiences of events or clips of events moving forward, which might produce a good promo opportunity for events. So the work stream that's looking at that is looking at that with our marketing teams as to how we actually can, it's not a YouTube channel as such, but something similar to that for the events industry in Scotland.
As a company ourselves, Paul, who always relied on face-to-face meetings for trainings and so on, and that stopped, of course, immediately, it forced us to think about packaging things, doing everything online. And then, of course, you realise that the world is your market rather than those that you can meet face-to-face. Now, is that the big message, if you like, for the events industry in Scotland, that we can be far more global if we can get the parallel, the hybrid, the virtual event running alongside the traditional face-to-face one?
Oh, very much so. And obviously that will depend from event to event, but there'll be some events that fit very nicely into that category that could have a much wider reach and provide the opportunity to, go to far new markets than you've ever probably had before. Business events is a classic one, whereby, traditionally you might well be looking at a UK domestic audience, but actually you could move that into a much wider geographical market.
Nick Roberts is asking a question about insurance. He says that he's heard of some companies quoting 7 times what they were quoting to cover events in the past. Is there any way in which your organisation can help discussing this with insurance companies to come up with some kind of realistic settlement?
I think insurance is a really worrying factor for me. Premiums around insurance, I've had similar cases where people have quoted increasing premiums. So really early on, when we went into lockdown and COVID with the government, we had a small group of event industry professionals meet with the Association of British Insurance Brokers in London and discuss about not just, premiums moving forward, but also about payments, particularly around business continuity and cancellation, particularly what the terminology of pandemic was. And I saw an article, which I hadn't actually read properly this morning, where this is now being challenged in London in the courts. And I do understand that some insurance companies now are starting to make payments against business continuity, which wasn't previously agreed. So there's a small glimmer of hope there, but obviously out of this, there is a risk and a danger that premiums could go up significantly.
Well, as ever, Paul, there are far more questions than we have time to get through, but thank you for dealing with each and every one of them that has come in as it's come in live. And of course, those that we were unable to get through, the Visit Scotland team will reply to in the next couple of days. Thank you very much for putting your time aside to do this. I know that the conversations will continue with the industry, Paul. And thank you to Colin, my colleague, for jumping in as the co-host when I lost my internet connection, the joys of technology. And thank you for everybody who's been on the call. I appreciate there's a lot of concern in the industry just now, but the more we all communicate, I'm sure the more we can find solutions. In the meantime, good luck in the next few months as we all rebuild our businesses from this. And thank you for all the contributors with your questions. And again, particularly to Paul Bush. Thank you very much.